Hello, BookTube. I'll start off the year 2024 with a boisterous Happy New Year to you all. It's wonderful to be talking to you again. And with a progress report of a type for my reading in 2024. My reading year in 2023 was the best reading year I've ever had in terms of numbers. It wasn't the best reading year I've ever had in terms of bright spots. Right? All of you know that distinction, and I'm sure you all keep track of both. There's numbers, there's the raw page count, but there's also how good the year was. 2023 was not a particularly good year for reading, for me. For new releases in the American book market, not particularly good. There were bright spots, but there weren't a constellation of them by any means. But the numbers were good, very good, the best that I've ever done, and I plan on exceeding them in 2024. And I'm off to a pretty good start. As of this morning, I have read 25 books so far in 2024. And I wanted to show you some of them and talk about some of them. Some of them are very much not worth talking about, but some of them are for various reasons. Some of them might interest you. Some of them are older, rereads, and some of them are new. We'll start with this one. This is this is not particularly accessible, but the publishers were very generous. This is a commentary on the Gospel of St. Luke by the Venerable Bede. Let's just get that over with. The Venerable Bede is one of my favorite writers from 1,000 years ago. He was prolific. You would never note it because he is now known only for one book, which is in a Penguin Classic, and sometimes taught in schools. But he was a prolific writer and part of a burgeoning literary scene. It would seem very rudimentary to us with social media and TikTok. There was no book talk in Bede's day. But the relatively few people, you could fit them in this building, who engaged in the very active life of the mind, very much were aware of each other's writings. They were aware of what each other were doing. This was a time when intellectual activity in the West was church activity, almost exclusively. They map almost exactly onto each other. And Bede wrote a lot along those lines, a huge amount of it. And you're not going to believe me. I realize that. I will control my enthusiasm. He's wonderful on the page. Any of you have ever read the one book that he's known for, the one book that you can get in the Penguin Classic, any of you have ever read it, even in English, he's wonderful on the page. He is enjoyable to read, very much so. That's why he was so popular. And by the time he did his big commentary on Luke, Luke is my favorite gospel. I know this work really well. Never expected to see a new annotated English language translation of it. Never in a million years. Leave it to university presses to do this. No one else could possibly do this. And by the time he wrote this, he was known and somewhat controversial for some other writings that he had done. They were eagerly passed around. They were eagerly known and discussed. And the more you know about that historical context in here, the more some passages in this leap out at you. There's a whole dissertation to be written. Probably somebody has done it, and it's in a cabinet somewhere. There's a whole dissertation to be written on Bede and his critics, on Bede's responses to his critics, which he never made independent. He never made them into independent works, but they are all through his writings, where he is sotto voce, or maybe not so subtly, he is responding to his critics. But he's also wonderful. He's wonderful at exegesis. So this was a delight. It's fiercely academic in a good way. A very rare example of something being fiercely academic in a good way. It's loaded with scholarship, which was, for me, that was a huge, huge draw for this book. I can't make any kind of a broad recommendation. Obviously not. This is a rocky thing to start. I should have started with something else. This won't appeal even to fans of biblical exegesis, because there's plenty of biblical exegesis that's being done now that's quite good. This, I loved it. It was an absolute treat to start the year, but I can't broadly recommend it. And I can't broadly recommend this next one either, even though I would like to. It's right in the wheelhouse of something that I should be able to recommend strongly. This is by Trish O'Kane, and it's called Birding to Change the World, in which our author goes through a catastrophe with Hurricane Katrina and is facing in the course of this book a catastrophe of another kind when it looks like her favorite patch of wilderness to bird in is going to be developed, improved. There's a huge amount about that in this book, and to me, it ended up being too much. The wonder of birding decidedly takes a back seat in this book. Now, the author is very lively prose stylist. So maybe if you read this, if you're a fellow birder, you won't mind. Maybe you won't mind. It never was boring, or strident, or tiresome. Just, I thought there was too much of it. It's always a careful balancing act when you do a what birding means to me type book. That's always a careful balancing act, and I myself as a reader don't prefer the ones that tip onto the human end. I want the ones that tip more onto the bird end. And this one did not. Then the next one is an older title, a reread. I read this, I don't even know how long ago. I have no idea. I'd only read it once, so it was basically new to me. There were bits and pieces, one gimmick in particular, that I remembered as soon as I encountered it. I'm sure that you mystery fans are similar in that regard. You read a murder mystery and you're not sure for like 20 or 30 pages whether or not you've ever read it. And then one of the things that's stuck in your mind, you suddenly come across it. The sundial. I have read this before. I had a little bit more memory of this thing than that, but still, this is Niall Marsh. This is Black as He's Painted, in which our main character, he is redoubtable, and he fleshes out in the books. He's actually a fairly interesting character on his own, Roderick Allen. But in this book, he has to be sort of a detached bodyguard for an old schoolmate of his who has come into the country. And one of the problems that you run into in genre fiction is that it tends not to be as three-dimensional as mainstream fiction. It's not worked over that way. That's not an emphasis of the writer when the writer is writing it. That's not an emphasis of the editors when they're working it over. And as a result, some of the things in these elements of genre fiction are more prone to dating, to becoming dated, than anything in, for instance, O Pioneers. You'll find this in romance novels, for instance, around issues of consent, which we have at least begun to make headway on in large parts of the world today. It is not a stupid, frilly, or silly thing to bring it up. Yes, aspects of both the alt-right and the alt-left have taken it way too far, exaggerated it way too far, but nevertheless, our consciousness, it sounds poncy to say, but our consciousness on the subject of consent has been raised. And that makes a whole swack of romance novels that have been written in the last 70 years tough. They're tough going. You might be able to look around it for other elements in the plot, but you'll feel a little dirty when you do it. And another element along those lines that our consciousness, in fits and starts and very painfully and certainly unevenly has been raised on the subject of race. And that this book does not fare well on that grounds. I went into it and started to remember the plot, started to remember the elements of the plot, and thought, oh, this is going to be trouble. I wonder. This author is actually very good. She's a mystery author. Obviously, Niall Marsh is very good. What I mean is she's very good at avoiding that kind of dating, usually. This was less successful at avoiding that than most of her books that I've reread recently, to the point where it was bugging me. And also, there's a cat, rather prominently, which didn't help things any. When are we going to raise our consciousness about them? I don't think that's ever going to help. Then we have, this next one is romance. This is the new book by Jill Shalvis, The Bright Spot. This is part of her Sunrise Cove series. Nominally, some romance series very, very much revolve around one particular area, a town, one particular town, and the appeal there is that you start to get to know the streets, you start to get to know the businesses, you start to get to know the colorful characters. They aren't just in one book, they crop up all around. And their stories marginally develop over time in the series, and that's very welcoming. That's a very, very cozy feeling to it. This is marginally that because that element is not stressed much in this book. I don't remember if I've ever read any other Sunrise Cove books. I think I might have read one, and I think I had the same reaction when I read that one, which was, boy, okay, it being called a Sunrise Cove novel, you're really expecting it to be largely about Sunrise Cove. You're expecting that element to be stronger, and it wasn't. And it's not strong in here either. So don't let that fool you, is what I'm trying to say. If you see this characterized on Goodreads or somewhere as a Sunrise Cove novel and you think, I've never read any others, don't let that fool you. That's not a strong element here, in the way it is with some other books. And this is a story of a woman who has she's been put through the ringer by life, and she has fetched up in Sunrise Cove and built a world that will not put her through the ringer anymore. A world full of trustworthy people and trustworthy things and vocations that are grounded in reality. She has built her world, in other words, to be disappointment proof. And when the action of this novel kicks off, it's all upended, and naturally it's a handsome man who is doing the upending. And the question here in the bright spot is the insecurities that led you to dig a hole and pull the dirt in after you. It doesn't seem that way, because the world that we see when we first meet this character in the beginning of this novel is very pleasant. But nevertheless, it's a retreat. The question here is, are you willing to risk something new? Something that at first, I mean for the first half of this book, seems destructive. Are you willing to risk that for the chance of adding something new that is wonderful? I'm a big Jill Shalvis fan anyway. It was a booktuber who originally turned me on to Jill Shalvis, where I'd been only peripherally aware of her. And I want to remember who that booktuber was. Some of you have been around BookTube for a long time. Once upon a time, there was a BookTube channel, a woman who was all about audio. She's all about audiobooks, long before they took off. I almost want to say her name was Jen. I've completely forgotten. She doesn't make videos anymore, hasn't made videos in half a decade, I think. But she was a huge Jill Shalvis fan. And she was also, an obvious, like the rest of you, an obvious real reader. So I thought, oh, okay. Well, then maybe I should pay more attention to Jill Shalvis, and I've been glad that I did since then. What was her name? The name of that channel, it's gone. But anyway, I enjoyed The Bright Spot. Then this next one I also enjoyed, but boy oh boy, not happy. A grim book, a necessary book, maybe the first important book, nonfiction book of 2024. And this is Sarah Scoles. This is her book Countdown, which is about the current state of nuclear weapons in the world. Nuclear weapons and nuclear power, but mainly nuclear armaments. I've read a couple of, 2 or 3 years ago, there were a couple of books on this subject. Near misses, close run things in terms of almost causing nuclear Armageddon that came out in succession and were grim and very interesting reading. This just takes it a little bit further. This is a wonderful author. She's absolutely fantastic, and she has done her homework in this book, but it is not easy reading. You'll start to wonder, or maybe you'll start to Google, just how close this problem is to you. Because it is a problem. The fact that it hasn't become one yet doesn't mean it isn't going to. And not in the long-term sense of like the Yellowstone super caldera, which sure is going to have a massive concatenation of eruptions, but more than likely in 200 million years. No, this isn't like that. This is going to be a problem. Of course, it's a much bigger problem now because 90% of the human population lives in or near cities. And they will be first strikes, and also are the highest likelihood of disaster. That isn't a nuclear strike, a nuclear meltdown. Boston is a very good example of that. Boston has one very prominent, well-known nuclear facility, and one that is not well-known, one that is in fact covert. But Boston would be a first strike for any launch of missiles in any case. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. It'll get you thinking thoughts like that. But it's extremely well done. It ought to be required reading for the head of every nuclear power. They don't read at all, but they should. This next one, I enjoyed it in a way, but mostly in a wry kind of way. This is a new anthology called A Hitch in Time. One of my worries here is that there are an infinite number of bad puns along those lines still to come. That this might be only the first one. Actually, Hitch 22 was the first one. This is the second one. This is a collection of writings of previously anthologized stuff of Christopher Hitchens to a new introduction. It's not very adventurously chosen. It's not very generous. It's twee in a way that Hitchens himself would have found revolting. He would have given this book a negative review in the pages of the National or whatever. Reflections ready for reconsideration. Good God. I had a rocky relationship with Christopher Hitchens when he was alive. I've had a rocky relationship with his writing, as long as he's been writing. He deserves better than this. And I don't know what the reason for it is. I don't know why we're not getting something better than this. Is this how we're remembering Christopher Hitchens now? A cute, gimmicky kind of anthology that reads like it was thrown together in an afternoon. I don't know. Maybe he is destined to just become a footnote to a footnote. Maybe the thing that's bothering me about this is that I kind of thought that wouldn't be true. But if you're a Hitchens fan, then probably you have read his big anthology, arguably, but maybe other anthologies as well. The introduction alone is not worth it for this new book. If you're not a Hitchens, if you haven't been a Hitchens fan, but you are curious, which is, I imagine, the market that this thing is designed for, this will probably do. This will probably do the trick. It's got all of you Hitchens fans might be wondering what's in here. It's everything you would expect, and nothing that you wouldn't expect. Every story that you would expect to be in here is in here. I would like to hope that if Hitchens were still alive, he would not have descended to the point where he would be bringing out anthologies like this on his own every Christmas. I'd like to think that he would be objecting to it. Then we have fiction. One of two pieces of fiction this year that so far that had an ominous note. I'm hoping this is not a trend for 2024. This is C.J. Box, and this is a Joe Pickett novel. Joe Pickett is a Wyoming game warden, and there have been dozens of Joe Pickett novels. I love them. I absolutely love them. I think they're all great. This is 3-Inch Teeth. And it is the story of two ruthless killers loose in the Wyoming wilderness, the endless Wyoming wilderness. Those of you who are not familiar with your American geography, feel free to Google Wyoming. I will remind you that there's the west coast of the United States. There's California. There's San Diego and Los Angeles, of course. There's also Portland, Oregon. And there's the East Coast with Philadelphia and New York and Boston. But in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains, there's a huge amount of space. Huge, right? You could sink Europe in there 3 times over. And Wyoming is a perfect example of that. I've trekked over a lot of Wyoming. And the two merciless killers that Joe Pickett has to deal with in this novel. One is a notorious bad guy who's been released. He's out of prison, and obviously has not reformed. He's not made amends. So he's a very human threat. But there's also a grizzly bear. That's the thing on the cover there. A grizzly bear that is suddenly causing problems. And grizzly bears tend not to cause small problems. The Joe Pickett novels are very contrived. I don't mean that in a bad way. They are very much C.J. Box, or whoever is writing under the name C.J. Box, assembling pieces in a kind of system design. When we talk about the looming threat of AI, of generative AI, novels like the ones by C.J. Box are the prime candidates for victimhood. The prime candidates. You wouldn't even need an advanced AI to write a Joe Pickett novel. I still find them very enjoyable. I don't know beyond a shadow of a doubt that an AI didn't write this book, but that's the split here. That's the plot gimmick here is that Pickett has to deal with both of those things. The 3-inch teeth. There's the obvious meaning of the title here is that grizzly bears have enormous teeth. I don't know what the writer of the book is thinking, or the creator of the title is thinking for 3-inch. An adult male grizzly bear's fangs can be much longer than 3 inches, but it also has a subtle meaning for the other bad guy in the book. And you get exactly what you want in law enforcement. Joe Pickett is not a cop per se, but this is a law enforcement type book that is set in the Wild West, basically set in the wilderness, and that has an action arc and a personal arc. You get exactly that. There are a number of novels out there. Joe Swagger is another character like this. There are a number of novels out there that will deliver that. I think broadly we could probably call it men's fiction. Are we allowed to call it that? I don't know. I'm certain that there are female readers of this series, but this is very much designed to keep your dad reading an hour past his bedtime. Only, unlike a lot of other books that are designed that way, these are not dumb. The Joe Pickett novels are not dumb. So I recommend it. I recommend it. Those of you who might be wondering where the hesitation is coming from here is that I have unfortunate memories of dealing not with escaped killer convicts, but with grizzly bears in Wyoming. They can be enormous, and they can turn up out of nowhere. And they're always in a bad mood. Black bears are not always in a bad mood, but grizzly bears always are. But anyway, then we get another reread. I think this might be the only other reread on the list for this weird 2024 check-in. All of you are now remembering why you didn't miss me. I'm afraid I have more books to go over here. I reread The Moral Obligation to Be Intelligent by Lionel Trilling. I have a picture here. This does not look like the paperback that I reread. This is a collection of his essays, a couple of which are famous to the limited extent that he's remembered at all now. Talk about Hitchens. I reread all of these. I periodically go back to this anthology. I think it's high time we got a longer Lionel Trilling anthology. That would be wonderful. But maybe I'm the only one who thinks that. Maybe that's why it hasn't happened. He did all sorts of extremely long, ponderous, textured, very pretentious, condescending, intellectual essays about literary subjects. He wrote a lot about cultural subjects as well. But you could double the size of this thing just on the literary stuff. And I don't believe anyone's ever done. There is, I've missed it. And every time I read one of these things on Wordsworth or William Dean Howells, or William Dean Howells is one of his famous essays, or a bunch of other things, Jane Austen, for instance, I get halfway through and ask myself, why am I reading this guy again? Why? He's so insufferable. And then I remember, because as many negative mannerisms as he has, and oh my God, does he have them? Oh my God, does he have them? This cover illustration is a real good example of what you'll be getting in the book. I think probably the mannerism that I noticed most this time around is how egregiously he was allowed by his various editors to digress. Oh my God. It'll go on for 5 solid paragraphs of an open digression. At any of the journals where I have worked as an editor, I would have just drawn an X, a big boxed X, through those whole passages, and with the margin note saying, this is all really, really eloquent. Cut it all, please. Don't summarize it. Don't synopsize it. Don't shorten it. Just cut it. Just remove everything from the end of paragraph 8 to the beginning of paragraph 17. Just remove it all. You can save it for your memoirs. I used to say that to writers. Save it for your memoirs. It doesn't belong in this piece. But no editor, as far as I can see, ever told Lionel Trilling that. And despite all of those mannerisms, I read him, and every single time I get more out of it. I am more and more thrilled. At heart, underneath his donnish exterior and his long we must considered and obviously and needless to says and all of that, underneath it all, he's just really good at writing about literature. He just really is. I don't know quite if all the people who were dealing with him originally had that kind of an ambivalent reaction to it, but I'm glad that I reread it. I wish I had this trade paperback rather than the one I have, but the one I have is pretty dog-eared anyway, and oh my god, it's highlighted to it fairly well every time. Every time I go through here, I tell myself, I've had enough of this guy. He is so pompous. He is so condescending. The pomposity regarding William Dean Howells, in that essay, is just unbearable. And then he extends it to Trollope. It's even worse. And yet, the points land. Even in the midst of that, the points land. And are fascinating to think about the connections that are drawn. I can't dismiss him. I can't do it. In fact, I estimate him higher every time I reread this book. So it was a problematic reread for 2024. And this next one, this is a new release. I don't know that it's out in bookstores yet, but its timing could not be worse. As is evidenced by my read-through of it. Because, again, though some of you might be new to this channel, I am a critic. I'm a reviewer. And when I go out a book, I force myself to open my mind to that book. I don't, when we're chatting here in these videos, I am perfectly happy to unhorse old saws about the evils of Stephen King or Cormac McCarthy. But when I encounter a new book, even by bête noire figures like that, I still force my mind open. It's not pleasant, because I am infallible. I force my mind open and deal with the thing on even terms, mainly because, not because I think that an old dog can change his tricks. If anything that the 150 years of reading Stephen King's swill has taught me, it's that an old dog can't change his tricks. Not so much that, as because if I don't do that, I am misserving my readers. That's why I'm doing this. So I cannot misserve my readers. If I go into it with a whole bunch of, it's you again, I'm not serving the reader to do that. So I tried to open my mind with this book, and I got a lot of it, but it was almost impossible. I don't believe that any reader of this book will be able to do it. This is by Ari Harrow, and it is called My Brother's Keeper, and it is about Benjamin Netanyahu dealing in his foreign policy with President Obama in the wake of 2014, in the wake of 2013, 2014, the Israeli state dealing with an uptick in terrorism, an uptick in international conflict, also dealing with Obama's twisty, sinuous pivots in terms of his foreign policy, particularly towards Iran. I don't believe that the definitive book about Obama's foreign policy has been written. I would really much appreciate it if somebody would write that book at 1,000 pages while Obama is still alive to help with it, to comment on it, flesh it out a little. Not that it has to exceed his viewpoint of things, but I'm sure he would be willing to help even in an even-handed assessment, and that would be valuable to do. I mean, as far as I know, that has never happened. In another time, in another reality, I would have cheered this from the rooftops as at least a step in that direction. Harrow was deeply involved in Netanyahu's staff, deeply involved in Israeli foreign policy. He's in perfect position to write about this. He's also a fairly good writer. That was one of the things I was trying to make myself notice when I was reading this book. Of course, the problem is not that this is dealing with events that are 10 years old. The problem is that this is coming out in 2024, when Netanyahu's far-right, extremely unpopular government is flattening Gaza, is drone striking and bombing hospitals and schools, flattening whole neighborhoods of innocent civilians. Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. This is a world event of almost unprecedented proportions in the modern era. And there is no possibility of framing that what Netanyahu is doing anymore as a response to the events of October 7th. There is no possibility of doing that anymore, no matter who you are, no matter how pro-Israel you are. There's no possibility of honestly doing that anymore. Instead, this is morphed into a nightmare, an absolute nightmare, and a nightmare that isn't over, by any means over. How is it possible to read this book now? How is it possible? I found it functionally impossible to read this book now. On almost every page, when I was reading, Harrow's very good. He is very good on almost every page when I was reading. Of course, Israel is going to look with a wary eye at Obama working hard through John Kerry to create a nuclear deal with Iran. Of course he's going to do that. Harrow's very good on that. He's very good on personalities. He keeps up a steady reading tempo on almost every page, despite all of those skills. I wanted to say, who cares? Who cares? Who cares about any of this now? The whole region is changing as a result of what this man is doing right now. Oh, is this our first siren of 2024? Oh no, barely visible. I bet that won't even be audible but anyway. So this is another case where I just have a big question mark to field to you. You might be interested in this subject, but I think it's safe to say that this landscape has changed so fundamentally in the last 4 months that I don't know of a way. I could not read this book except in the lens of that, and that was probably unfair to the book, but no way around it. Absolutely no way around it. I mean, picture. Suppose there is an asteroid out there that's 10 kilometers wide. And let's say it's not reflecting any sunlight, so no one on Earth knows that it's there. That could easily be true. Let's say that asteroid is out there, and let's say that it strikes Earth next week. It'll be traveling at 5 times the speed of sound when it hits the Earth. It won't kill all life on the planet, but it will kill all life in a country and disrupt supply chains, agriculture, the atmosphere for 100 years. Say that happens later this year, and then this time next year somebody brings out a book that had already been in galleys about major asteroid impacts. You wouldn't be able to read that book. You wouldn't even be able to see it in light of what had happened in between, the same way. Maybe you'll have better luck. Then, to get off the grim subject, we'll get to, this is a book that was suggested to me. It's, I think, 10 years old. It was suggested to me by one of those aggregator sites that I like so much. You give them your email, and they send you the day's deals in terms of ebooks for Amazon. They don't have to be Kindle Direct, though. But they are the ebook deals. And you can sign up for a whole bunch of other things that don't have to be Amazon. You can do the same thing for iBooks and Kobo and whatnot. And I've read a ton of books because of those aggregator sites and found some of them to be quite interesting. Some of them are garbage. Most of them are garbage. 90% of all books that come out are crud. But then 90% of everything is crud. But I read one that I kind of liked recently that I thought I would put on this list. This is by Lyle Nicholson. I think this came out in 2013. This is the other recurrence of the ominous thread that I'm hoping to nip in the bud right now. I do not want to be reading this thread for all of 2024. And this is called Polar Bear Dawn. And this is about a detective named Bernadette Callahan. She is a wonderfully drawn character. Just wonderful. A lot of times in these things, that's not true. The writers oftentimes, especially in the police procedural, they're oftentimes expecting that the police procedural part will carry the game, and that they don't need to invest people with personalities. I think it's a terrible shame that a lot of them think that way. A lot of them clearly have either not read Ed McBain's Precinct novels or not learned from them. That you won't get where you're going that way. The stories have to be full of personalities. Bernadette is a wonderful personality, and there are a couple of other really well-drawn characters in this book that deals with a bear attack. It's not central. At first, as this plot unfolds, it looks like a man has been mauled to death by a polar bear. So in this case, not a grizzly bear, but the only bear on Earth that's bigger. It looks like that's true. The polar bear was in an alleyway in a city in the far outskirts of Alaska and British Columbia, the Canadian Northwest. You will get polar bears that come into cities. You have to take precautions. Those little towns, it's not just Barrow, Alaska. Lots of towns have to take polar bear precautions. Make sure that your town dumpsters are sealed. Make sure that they are not in a tempting location. Your own garbage, be really careful about it. Because if you go out, if you think, oh, this kitchen bag, it's so full of trash, I'm just going to put this out in the garbage and I'll be right back in. If it's snowing outside and it's nighttime and you surprise a polar bear, you might not come back in for cutlets and reruns of Murder, She Wrote. Anyway, that's the scenario at the beginning of this book. But it quickly strikes Bernadette and one other law enforcement character in this book, that that might not actually be true. The polar bear might only have been scavenging of someone who's already dead and was murdered. And it just keeps going from there. I loved it. I think I missed this completely when it came out originally. But then again, that's one of the reasons that I love these aggregator sites, is that a lot of the stuff that they're putting in your inbox every day is not new. It's not 2023 or 2024 release. And a lot of it is indie. This is indie. I could easily miss that. Easily. My bailiwick is the mainstream American publishers. I could easily miss stuff that's really good. In this case, I did. So I do recommend this. When I got this, it was free. My hard and fast rule for those aggregator sites is that no ebook deal is a good ebook deal unless the deal is the ebook is free. 99 cents, $1, $1.99, $2.99. No, that way lies damnation. No, you should just train your brain so that it's not even seeing something that has a price tag. If it's free, though, no harm, no foul. So I'm going to have to check to see if Lyle Nicholson ever wrote any other adventures of Bernadette Callahan. I imagine he's probably written 20 in the last 10 years. But Polar Bear Dawn, I can recommend. Bernadette Callahan, early on in the story, Bernadette's her instincts are great. Her life in the job is well described. And early on, she becomes certain that there's foul play involved, a lot fouler than a one-ton polar bear. And right after her instincts tell her that, her instincts also tell her, and then she is explicitly told, no, back off. Don't investigate this. And she has to decide, and decides fairly quickly, almost immediately, what the right thing to do is. Just wonderful. Just wonderful. Really liked it. We're gonna keep barreling on here. I know all of you are now remembering why you didn't miss this channel, but a few more books I want to talk to you about. Like this one, I mentioned this in another video today. This was a December release in 2023 that got to me late. I concentrate on the new year when I'm in the new year, but I'm not a zealot about it. If somebody sends me a book that I missed, I'm still going to read it. And I'm glad I did, because this was really, really good. This is by Dennis Romano, and it's a big, heavy, well-illustrated one-volume history of Venice in the last 1,000 years. A lot of you, over the years here at this channel, have asked me for recommendations along exactly this line. John Julius Norwich is usually the book that I've recommended. A lot of people ask me for recommendations along these lines because, again, for you new people, I know Venice really well. I knew Venice really well. I lived there. It's my second favorite city on earth. If Boston did not exist, I would be living in Venice. I would be doing you booktube from Venice, but I would find a cheap apartment somewhere if it's still possible to do. I lived in the Dorso Duro for a long time and really, really enjoyed it. So it's a sweet spot of mine. I would read this anyway, though. It could be Constantinople. I would still read a history like this, a serious history that just fell through the cracks, came in under the wire for 2023, wasn't part of any 2023 year-end list, won't be part of my 2024 year-end list, obviously. But this was really, really good. Romano covers a lot of different moving aspects of the city's history in really, really thorough ways. I wholeheartedly recommend it. I think it's an Oxford University Press publication, so it will probably be nosebleed expensive. Sorry about that if that's true, but if you've got a discrete book budget for 2024 and you haven't tapped it yet or exhausted it yet, you probably have exhausted it yet because you're all bookworms. But if you're interested in this subject, at the very least, you could maybe get your library to get a copy. They should. It's the best one-volume history of Venice that I've ever read. So strongly recommend it. It's just the price tag, that's all. Then we have a work of contemporary fiction. Probably that's going to be a rocky road in 2024, but it wasn't. It didn't start off that way. I read this. I read Bonnie Jo Campbell's book, The Waters, about a weird woman herself who lives. This is in Michigan, and it's up in the wilds of nowhere. And there's a town, and then there's a boggy, marshy creek backed up to a river. So you can't just walk into the area called the Waters. You have to there's a homemade bridge leading from the town to the waters, and then you can't go anywhere after that because it's a rushing river on the other side. And on an island in the waters, in this swampland, lives this woman, and she has 3 daughters. And this is the story of the weird relationship between that woman and her daughters and the town. Herself has been a provider of folk remedies for a long time in the memory of the town. But lately has withdrawn. She expelled her husband from the island. First of all, that seemed to be the turning point. After that expulsion, the people in town noticed a lot of her home remedies, although they swear by them, changed. They became bitterer, harsher. They still worked, but seemed to work, but they weren't the same. And that was a sea change with her daughters as well. And one of those daughters, of course, the standard gimmick for fiction is that there's actually only one plot. In all fiction, there's only one plot. A stranger comes to town. And Bonnie Jo Campbell, bless her, she does not care that some of the gimmicks that she might be using narratively here might be well-worn or predictable. A stranger comes to town, or a known item, but it's the youngest daughter of herself, and she is strange. And an unknown quantity. She comes to town bearing surprises. And it's wonderful. I didn't know what I was expecting going into this book. Maybe a kind of ham-handed fourth wave feminist allegory of some kind or other. We've talked on this channel many times about how so much of that crackpot ideology, that man-hating ideology, has infested publishing. Seems to have infested publishing. I'm barking my shins against it all the time when I'm looking at new releases. I guess maybe I was expecting something like that. I mean, it seemed to set itself up that way, but not only did I not get that, but I was not expecting how evocatively written this is. God, it was wonderful to read. Harsh, hard. It's a hard book, but wonderful to read. I loved it. What can I say? My 2024 has now had a bright spot for reading fiction. I'm waiting. In 2024, I will collect bright spots in reading. There weren't as many of them in 2023 as I wanted by a long shot. But in 2024, I will collect them. This is one of them. Absolutely one of them. So, don't know what I was expecting. Your library will certainly have this. It's a mainstream release. Your library will certainly have a copy. Might want to check it out. I think you will like it. And then we'll finish up, because I no sooner start making videos in 2024 than I start going over long in videos in 2024. We'll finish up with another thing that it was also a pleasant surprise to me. This is Maria Fredericks. This is her book, The Wharton Plot. A murder mystery starring Edith Wharton, which I was expecting would follow the cookie-cutter template of this kind of thing. You plug in Barron's books on Jane Austen is a perfect example. Although I love them, they are very cookie cutter. They are find a historical figure, learn a little bit about them, figure a time period when they're available to solve mysteries. So they can't be giving birth. They can't be locked up in a mental institution or anything like that. They have to be free and clear to navigate, and then just plug them in to one murder mystery after another. And I was kind of expecting that with this, and I was dreading it. And this is not that at all. It isn't being billed by the publisher. I don't remember who the publisher is here, but it's Minotaur Books, I think. And they are a mystery publisher, if I'm right about that. They aren't explicitly billing this as an Edith Wharton murder mystery. Instead, they're billing it as a historical novel starring Edith Wharton in which there is a murder. But they shouldn't. They should steer as far away from that as possible, because it's true. This is a novel that's starring Edith Wharton. And it's true that right after the book starts, a writer is murdered. Shot 7 times right in front of Gramercy Park. I've been to Gramercy Park many, many times, and many, many times I've seen people, especially people who own keys to the gates, that I'd love to shoot 6 or 7 times, but I've never done it. And somebody does that to the writer at the beginning of this book. He'd already had an unpleasant encounter with Mrs. Wharton. Not in the sense of yelling insults at her, but they were definitely barbed at each other. And all the worse because she can't completely discount that any of the things he was saying about her are wrong. which is rough because the Edith Wharton in this book is delightfully imperious, delightfully so. Later on in the book, when she's talking with an author, she's talking about how she paid a visit to that dead author's publisher. A question is briefly raised by the author. Well, how could you just barge into their offices? I mean, how did they know who you were? And she just briefly says, "I am Edith Wharton." And you get it. You get it. That feels completely natural. That never goes away. Fredericks does not try to make Edith Wharton all things to all people. She does not try to make her cuddly at all. And yet she is so winningly drawn here because she can't let go. Maybe if she hadn't had that encounter with the author, and maybe if you hadn't said things that got onto her skin, her patrician skin, maybe she would have been able to just ignore it as an item in the news. But she can't let go. She wants to know what's going on here. And does pursue it. It's not Murder, She Wrote. She's not opening back windows to kitchens and whatnot. She mostly pursues it from bed. But she does pursue it. She can't let it go. And I loved it. Just loved it. I don't remember liking the Lindbergh Nanny anywhere near as much as I like this. I thought this was fantastic. Maybe it was personal. The Lindbergh Nanny was her breakout book. Probably a lot of you have read it. Your library certainly has multiple copies of the Lindbergh Nanny, and probably the reasons that it didn't gel with me is that it were personal, because it had to take you in cheek by jowl with Charles Lindbergh, who was a kind of proto-fascist, proto-Trump figure. And that's a sore spot. In 2024, that's an extreme sore spot. I'm perfectly willing to admit that when I read the Lindbergh Nanny, I probably was not in the right headspace to appreciate what it did. I should probably go back to it. I don't know that I'd do any better. 2024, that is even worse. But here I didn't have to worry about that, because here's the publishing world, the book world. And where you can't go wrong in a book where Henry James is supporting characters. I love this. I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. So if you're interested at all, I would strongly advise. Strong recommend here. So see, there we can finish up there. That was a 2024 progress report that wasn't all bad. Right? It wasn't all, oh, that was a stinker. Oh, there's another stinker. No, there are plenty of things I can recommend, even this early in the year. So maybe this bodes well for 2024, from my reading experience in 2024. Maybe it does. But anyway, that is a kind of a progress report. This has gone on quite long enough, so I'm sorry to present you with, once again, a 45-minute video. It's so soon in the year, but I'll wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.